This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft, because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello, and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Robert, Kathryn, and I are talking about faces. I was reading something recently, I think it might have been Charles Baxter, and he mentioned trying to get a student to describe a character's appearance, and the student kept floundering and failing, and he was saying, describe the face, and finally the student said, but that's hard. And I thought about all of the manuscripts I read as an editor and teacher and all of the people I work with and my own writing too, and I was like, people do not describe faces the way they used to in literature, and I thought, how interesting. And so I got out my journal and I made myself write descriptions of my characters' faces. I knew I described my characters' movements and their relationships and appearance generally, but had I really brought the reader's focus, the reader's gaze upon my characters' faces. So anyway, I will challenge everyone to describe faces. But first, what's hard about writing faces? Why don't people do that?
Oh, man.
What? I don't even know what my characters look like. So, that's the big problem, isn't it? You just ask what's hard. Well, that's it. I can tell, one of them's got red hair and is tall. There you go. That's all you need to know. I think, but the modern style is to be very to back off, I think, on descriptors and let the reader imagine who they are. Yet, if I think about watching the movie version of Lord of the Rings, I'm remarkably surprised at how comfortable I am with the actor depictions of the characters you've come to know and love. You sort of go, I think that's reasonable. That's a really good rendition of Gollum. That's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it was what Tolkien imagined, I don't know. But face. I can do the frowns and the quirking lips and the eyebrows and the scratching of the noses and the stroking of the chins masterfully.
Sure.
But I've got no idea what their face looks like.
Right. But do they have a big nose?
Right. Okay, brown hair, hazel eyes, and a square jaw. Yep, right. That's it.
Yeah,
well,
that's it.
No, that doesn't really depict a face. It doesn't evoke a face. It just lists a couple of features.
I think that my initial hesitation to this would be, how would you work it into a manuscript in a way that didn't feel incredibly awkward? And we've talked about describing characters before in the whole let's look in a mirror thing. And if you're talking about someone's face, especially my protagonist's face, I think I would really struggle to figure out where to put that. Now, necessarily having to do the whole face in one description would probably not have to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
But for my own edification, no, I've never done that, but I kind of want to now.
I can tell you, having just done it, that what I wound up with in my journaling and my discovery writing, I have since inserted into my manuscript where I'm describing the character, but the process is to be artful both in your description. So it isn't just a listing of features and coloring, but something that describes the face while revealing the character, and then to place it in the narrative where it flows, where it makes sense. So it isn't like dropping it in plunk, I could read you a couple if you like. Okay. Tommy had been born with a square head, all angular and so sharp a block it was a miracle he didn't cut his mother on the way out. His eyes burned with an anger that scorched those close to him, but would never be useful, warming, or purging. His hair had darkened as he left boyhood to deep rust color, and his freckles lost any charm they once had. If only he could laugh without meanness, it would change everything about him.
Nice. Yeah. So we describe faces because we want to reveal character. And I'm thinking about some study I'm doing at the moment in the Story Group Guild with respect to beats and using exposition in beats. So you're starting to now get into the author voice as opposed to the character voice. And the way that you can use even small word choices, tiny word choices, which you did there, to express specific elements of either order, complexity, or chaos. And so, as some examples they've given, for example, is that I won't go through them all, but if you're describing Poirot, for example, then the description is very ordered. It's very exacting. I've got one here. His head was exactly the shape of an egg, which threw me when I read it, but anyway. And he always perched it a little on one side. His moustache was very stiff and military. So we already have some sense of the stiffness and the military allegory in there that says, this person is going to be quite regimented.
Is that description Christie's? Is that from Christie? Yeah. I just watched Kenneth Branagh's Murder on the Orient Express, and in the opening, Poirot is like obsessed about an egg. He's got people bringing him his eggs, hard or soft boiled, like one after another, and he measures them and they have to be perfect. So that's very funny that her description introduces him that way.
Maybe Agatha Christie had to think about eggs.
Maybe, yes.
Yeah. But anyway, we digress. Obviously, the description that you just read out, it reveals character. Agatha Christie's reveals character. So we're not describing, as Kathryn said, there's got to be purpose behind it. And I really like the idea that you can choose either, say, order, complexity, or chaos in not just faces, but anything descriptive. But certainly in faces, that would be where you want to, because one of the ones that they give as an example for chaos is from Treasure Island. And it's not just about a face, and the saber cut across one cheek, a dirty, livid white. So again, we're not saying, the guy had an evil-looking face, which is so what? But it's beautiful. It's chaotic. A dirty, livid white cut across one cheek. It's interesting.
Yeah, I don't know that I would have said you were describing a face. Like if I had just come across that in the book that I was reading, I would have just said you were giving me the character. I don't know that I would have even so that's really cool, because in saying I'm going to describe their face, which realistically, when you look at someone, you're reading a lot from their face. Like that's a perfect gateway into who the character is. Yeah. And so you're describing the face, but really what you're doing is describing their internal being. I got so much more about how he's kind of brutish and a little bit angry all the time than I did about the fact that he had a square head and rust-colored hair. That wasn't, I could take that out of it, but that wasn't the point. So I kind of like how this has kind of flipped me around. So now I feel less like we're describing faces and more like we're approaching describing characters in a really cool new angle or way.
Are you curious about group coaching for fiction authors? And I am accepting applicants ready to join a great group of writers. Group coaching participants love the consistent feedback loop while working on their novels and ongoing access to an experienced storycraft coach with a decade in developmental editing, teaching, and personalized coaching. Want to take a peek at one of our sessions?
I don't know. That's what I'm struggling with. Is this enough to hold somebody's full attention?
Okay, so stop asking, is this enough? And instead say, what if? So what if Leia gets the notice that the house is going to be seized? Well, she can leave Dan. She can confront Dan. She can, right? So come up with as many options as you can. Don't limit yourself. Nothing is weird. Nothing is crazy. Nothing is out of bounds. Nothing is outrageous or ridiculous. Come up with lots of options.
Okay.
And then pick the one that's most exciting. And maybe you combine a couple, like she packs her bags to leave Dan, but she's not going to leave until she has a chance to confront him, right? So you put those two together. Dan comes home. She confronts Dan. She says this, he says that. And what happens? Well, they agree. They still love each other. They're going to work it out. She leaves. She kicks him out instead. Do that brainstorming. Come up with as many things as you can. And don't worry about whether or not it's enough. If you keep following the trail of what's exciting, what feels like it's got some momentum behind it, then you've already got evidence that it's enough, right? Do you want to have your concerns addressed and questions answered in real time as you work on your novel? Want to have a writing partner for support and accountability? Want to continually hone your craft instead of getting stuck in writing old habits? Then apply today for the new session. Details are at wordessential.com/fiction-group-coaching. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. I would love to chat with you. There are contact forms at wordessential.com and also at storyworkspodcast.com. Now back to this week's episode. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And I think that's what I was going for, but I didn't sit down to go for it. I sat down with my journal to do discovery writing and to see what their faces look like. And I know Tommy is angry and rough, and he's late adolescent young man type of character. And, I could have said he's got a big head and auburn hair, and, he looks at people meanly, and that wouldn't convey the feeling that I wanted to convey.
Yeah. Well, and this is just another example of you need to play to get further than your initial thought, right? So like you could have just sat down and said, oh, what does his face look like? And maybe the first three things you did write down were he's got a square face and mean eyes and red hair. And then you spin that. Okay, so, how can I express this that also expresses him? And you keep going and going and going until you end up with the artistry, right? Because at the end, it's almost like a poetic version of a description where it digs down below those layers. But you can't just get that from just sitting down and saying, I'm just going to describe him.
Right.
At the end.
Yeah, I really like what you said, Kathryn, as the way of thinking about it, which is we as human beings extract so much from a person's face that if you imagine talking to somebody without, with a bag on their head, there's so much information missing. We talk about somebody being very expressive. Well, so we know there are some cultural differences. Some of the Europeans are very expressive with their hands and their bodies, and the English people are very stiff and don't have much expression in their voice. But those are traits that are going to also appear in facial expressions and face styles. So it's interesting that what you brought to the table here, Alida. What is it that you think? How were faces described, and why were they useful? Is there any reasoning behind why we're not doing that so much now?
Well, I think faces, like much narrative in general, were described with more imagery, with more metaphor, with more simile, so that we got a sense of the character through a more expansive, I want to say portal, which I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the word I want to use. Whereas a lot of writers today are thinking in a restrictive manner too literally and visually, like, okay, I've got this character in front of me. I'm going to go online and I'm going to Google, pictures who sound like what I want. And then I'm going to look at that picture and that's my character. And how do I describe that person? Well, that person's got long black hair and maybe olive skin and maybe this and that. And so then by being so literal and maybe using those reference points, instead of just opening up the imagination, we get descriptions that focus on a list of traits, like you're trying to describe a photograph to somebody who's not looking at it, instead of trying to give the reader the impression you would have if you met Tommy in the bar and you saw Tommy and you'd be like, oh, I'm going to go drink over here.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I think you hit on something really strong there when you said we're used to imparting a visual. Like we, at this point in life, most stories come to us through a visual medium.
Yeah.
And so I think people have maybe taken that for granted, or maybe they've kind of lost the ability to think beyond that, and need to retrain themselves, right? It's not like you can't go get it, right? But you have to think differently. Yeah. And I think, thinking back 150 years ago in literature, they didn't have the same point of reference for visual storytelling as we do. And so their visual was so much more, like you said, imagery, getting all of those senses involved so that you could picture it in your brain. And we just kind of hope people can see the same thing we do because we're so used to that idea of just describing what we see happening rather than living within the story.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And hoping that people see what we see in that regard is so limiting. It's limiting the reader's experience of the story because the reader experiences what we present. And so if you only present this list of traits, and then the reader has to infer through dialogue and action everything else, you are not giving, you're failing to give the reader the, perception of the character that comes from so much other varied sources of input, like the imagery, like the metaphor, like the simile, like his eyes burned with an anger that scorched those close to him, but would never be useful, warming or purging. As I was writing, I was like, well, burning is good and bad. You need fire. You need to be warm. You need to cook, right? And adding that in there, adding the negative, what his gaze would never do, along with what his gaze does do, it burns felt like a much fuller impression could be made, could be given to the reader than if I just said he had a burning gaze or he had angry eyes or something.
It's very challenging to do, isn't it, without devolving into descriptive features. So what you've done there is you've used interpretations, which makes sense according to what Kathryn was saying. We're going to interpret everything from a person's face. I mean, when you first meet a stranger, you immediately sum up, you feel whether you're going to like them or not, and that can change because all of a sudden they open up you, or you chat to them, or you find a common ground, and then their face is no longer a face of threat, it's a face of shared experience. So it's interesting what we attach to it, and we attach to the facial expressions our own baggage. So some of that's going to come from the perception of the character that is describing the other character, or the author if it's omniscient. So I have not really thought about using this before as a specific vehicle. I think it's clever. It's another way of revealing something that you don't necessarily want to, have the playwright leap out on stage and say, hey, let's just pause a moment here. I want to explain this character to you,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I saw something recently, heard, I forget where, but somebody was criticizing the way playwrights would describe a character, before the play begins, you list all the characters who are in the play and you give them a description. And somebody was saying they shouldn't describe the physical traits of the character because the actor is going to bring that to the character. So you leave that off the page and you just use other descriptors. And I think that's interesting. I think it's true that you should not limit the actor who can play the character based on that physical description. But if we look at the description as doing more, then it's not there to limit who could play this character. It's there to give us a sense of who this character is. And I was looking at Eugene O'Neill's Long Day's Journey into Night, and when he describes Mary, the mother, he describes her physical appearance, but it's the appearance of a woman of a certain age who has been suffering with an addiction to, I think it's opium that she was prescribed, and this is set in like 1912 to 1918, Edwardian period. And, the youthful beauty of her face is still there, but she's lost weight. So there's kind of a gauntness, and the hands have some arthritis. And so in the state of her hair, all of it was significant. And it wasn't about, well, somebody who's plump can't play this character because she's been wasting away. Like, sure, with her addiction, you might actually say that, but it wasn't about limiting who could act this role. It was about depicting who this person is in a physical being, as a physical presence on the stage, interacting with other characters. And as writers, I think we need to take our descriptions of character away from what does this person look like and bring it into who is this character as a physical being.
And I think this is where you lose the descriptions that then make me go, wait, what, why, what are, because I like you were mentioning like how tall a character was or something. And I hate it when that's thrown in there as a detail, but then it doesn't actually matter. Whereas if you think about them as an internal person, like maybe their height does matter because of the way they interact with the world. They're big and they're big in the world, right? And that's the way that they interact with it. But thinking about it in those terms changes what descriptors are important and which ones you're going to impart to the reader.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. And how much of the description can you show through interaction instead of through strict narrative description? One of my other ones, Timothy, wound up being through the mother's eyes. So I was describing this child through the mother's point of view in my narrative instead of just telling the reader what Timothy looks like. And then that made the description relational because the mother is thinking about him in relation to her other children and her own sense of their family and their worldview. And I think that for this character is a much more interesting way to describe him.
Yeah, it's definitely it's a skill set, that's for sure. And it would be, I think Kathryn's right where I was going to say the same thing, with our exposure to the visual arts, it's so dominant, and especially with the advent of the smartphone and tablets, that it would be easy to just fall back on visual descriptors. But in actual fact, what we want is expressive descriptors of visual attributes, which show those visual attributes under expression as if we were relating with that person here and now. So definitely, I'll have to try this because I've got some characters that I need to have more description of than just them being an enemy, a villain, and having gone down the path of the cape and the moustache twirling in the past, I can see now that there's some interesting ways to do this. That's going to make the next scene I have to write quite interesting. So,
yeah. I like that phrase you used, expressive descriptors. And I think when we do this, we are still letting the reader create the picture of the character in his own mind. We're still giving the reader that freedom to develop the image of the character, because we aren't limiting the reader to rusty hair and dark eyes and a big square jaw, right? We're giving that expression.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you could imagine if all three of us put our driving license or passport photo online and ask people to describe us as a person, then it might be different to the way they describe us from our podcast.
Yeah, you're right.
He's fresh out of prison.
Well, so much of our description in this, so much of what I was doing in this journaling was getting at my character's person as opposed to my character's visual, right?
Yeah.
So then I was really leaving the photograph away. So you're right. If somebody never listened to the podcast and tried to describe our faces from still photos, they wouldn't know anything about us. So they could just look at the traits. But if somebody has been following the podcast, then they would know things about our voices, about how much we gesture when we talk, about the way we laugh, about the shape of our smiles. And so those things would hopefully inform the descriptions.
So that's what you have to think about then when you're describing a face as an author, is you're not looking at a still, which is, I think, when you first said about this, nobody describes faces anymore. I have in my mind, okay, so what's the point of that? Why would I want to do that? But then as soon as you gave the example, of course you want to do it that way. It's just another part of the way a character walks, talks, and appears. But what you're saying is that there's less attention paid to the expressive nature of the parts of the face and the set of the face, compared to in a lot of the book descriptions that I do. We ask for character descriptions. Well, actually, we don't. We ask for what are your characters like internally and externally. And often when we say what are your characters like externally, the author just describes them. Well, they have brown hair and they have green eyes with gold flecks, and okay.
Our hero, who has brown hair and green eyes, rescues.
Yeah. So so clearly they've got an idea in their mind about how they look, and it's unfair to just put it. This is just in the context of a submission form. So who knows how they come to life in a natural story? But it's interesting that I've never even bothered with that much, because I just felt it was it demeans the reader's experience. But I can see now with what you're saying is that there are things that I may have missed as little tools to help bring the story of the character even more to life. And then coupled with what we've been doing in StoryGrid, where you could direct that in particular ways in order to convey some of your authorial theme without being heavy-handed. I think now we're starting to get really clever.
Yeah, definitely.
There you go. Who would have thought? Faces.
I would have thought. So much to unpack in one word. Faces.
Yeah, faces. Why do we have them?
Thank you for listening to the StoryWorks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.